Hello again, biology. We're going to be talking about a couple different theories today about how we got from non-living things to living cells. Okay, so we're actually going to start with um, abiogenesis, and endosymbiotic theory will come later. So abiogenesis is really kind of going to tell us where cells came from, like the original cells. Endosymbiotic tells us how eukaryotes came to be. Okay, so let's talk about abiogenesis a little bit. Actually, first, I need to talk about cell theory. So, 3 points to cell theory. All living organisms are made of cells. The cell is the basic structure and organization for organisms. So, when we're going down to the smallest living part of an organism, not down to the molecules and the atoms, because those are not living, but the cell is actually living and functioning on its own, but is a part of a larger organism, right? And then cells have to come from other cells. So cells have to replicate themselves and divide in order to make more cells. Okay, so back to abiogenesis. So we had non-living matter that was hanging out on Earth, right? The primordial ooze type of stuff that we hear about. We had natural, chemical, and physical processes that actually came together and created simple organic molecules from just the little bit of, molecules and various atoms that were hanging out already. Okay, so they reacted and they made simple organic molecules. And then we had the sun, we had volcanic heat, and a lot of movement, and those molecules formed more and more complex molecules, and eventually those became the building blocks of the first cells. Okay, this was proved by the Miller-Urey experiment, and that was in 1952. Okay, and here's what it looks like. So this is supposed to replicate what was happening about 3.5 billion years ago when we only had those non-living molecules just hanging out, and we end up making organic compounds. So we have water, we have methane and ammonia and hydrogen, and those are all here. Well, they're here. And then they had these electrodes that were hooked up that were simulating lightning because 3.5 billion years ago there was just just think of Earth as a very tumultuous place, right? So there's lightning, there's like a lot of stuff happening in water and da da da, but there's like nothing alive there yet, right? So it's just a lot of movement. Anyway, so this water gets boiled, mixes with those gases, they have this electric spark that's happening. So it's creating this chemical reaction, and then it's cooling it off. So it's evaporating here, and then it's condensing back down. Now, at the end of this experiment, they ended up testing, and they found at least 5 amino acids. But later on, they retested some of the samples, and there were about 20 amino acids. So amino acids, remember, are make proteins, and so that's kind of like the beginning building blocks of life. So Miller and Urey made this experiment, and they got some of the building blocks of life out of it. So that kind of shows how it happened, right? So RNA was the first self-replicating information storage molecule, so this is more simple than DNA. And it was catalyzed by the assembly of the first proteins. So those amino acids form proteins, right? And then basically that's eventually the RNA came along after that. And you can see how it kind of happened right here. We have the RNA macromolecules, it can self-replicate, and then we get more proteins. Okay, so more about that experiment, kind of, they have shown that amino acids tend to make, when they're in short chains, they kind of make these little circles. And so they think that that's the beginning of like cellular organization, about how cells kind of tend to kind of clump together a little bit. So, like we talked about earlier this week, prokaryotic cells were the most simple, and therefore they were the first cells that came. So they just had this ring of DNA and it's just hanging out. Remember, we don't have a nucleus. Okay. Now we're going to talk about endosymbiotic theory. So I had mentioned that mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA. Well, this endosymbiotic theory is the most prevalent, accepted theory about how this came to happen. And in science, a theory isn't really just like, yes, I have a theory. A theory is something that is evidence-backed, and pretty much the entire community agrees with it. But in science, things do change. So, scientists try not to be stubborn. So if something did appear that proved that this theory was wrong, then something else would come from that. But a theory is, you can almost think of it as factual, at least in the eyes of what kind of support it has. So anyway, sorry about that. So eukaryotic cells, they are more complex than prokaryotic cells. So this happened through endosymbiosis. Symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms that benefits both of them. So endo means in. So endosymbiosis would be one organism living inside another, and they're both benefiting from that. Versus, a sea anemone and a clownfish. They're not living inside of one another. It's living among each other, right? So endosymbiosis, living inside. So chloroplasts and mitochondria have their own DNA. They reproduce independently from the rest of the cell. So mitochondrial DNA is actually from the mother's line of DNA, instead of like how you have half and half from your mother and your father. You have half of your DNA from there, but not your mitochondrial DNA. That usually just comes from your mother. Chloroplasts and mitochondria are about the same size as bacteria. They also have their own ribosomes, so they make their own proteins. And that is basically the same description as a prokaryotic cell. So the theory of endosymbiosis says that chloroplasts and mitochondria were originally independent prokaryotes, and they now live inside eukaryotic cells because they provide energy in both situations, right? The mitochondria goes through cellular respiration, provides energy to animal cells, and plant cells, and then the chloroplast actually makes the glucose for the plant cells. So, and they're getting protected, and they're able to, quote unquote, reproduce with no issues. So that would be why they would have gone in there in the first place. So as you can see from here, we have an old prokaryote, we have some like folding, just like changes happening, a nucleus forming, and then it engulfs these aerobic heterotrophic prokaryotes. So basically this would be the mitochondria, and then in this one it engulfs a photosynthetic prokaryote. So we have a photosynthetic eukaryote, which would end up being a plant cell, and an old heterotrophic eukaryote, which means heterotrophic means it has to still find its food instead of making its own. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed. I definitely think it's interesting. Let me know if you have any questions, and feel free to kind of look around about cell theory on your own.